The tray slipped from his shaking hands, crashing onto the tile floor. The sound echoed through the busy restaurant, but no one turned to help. No one even looked. Ethan Carter, CEO of a fast-growing restaurant chain, stood frozen in his ill-fitting uniform, stunned. His heart pounded as he bent down, struggling to scoop up the scattered fries and spilled soda. The manager, a short, wiry man named Rick, walked past without a glance. A few employees smirked. A couple of customers shook their heads, but not a single hand reached out. Ethan had built this company from the ground up, pouring years of hard work into making it a household name. But lately, complaints had been piling up. High turnover rates, unhappy employees, customers frustrated with rude service. His executives had given him reassurances, but something didn't sit right. So, he decided to see the truth for himself. Dressed as Eli, a new trainee, Ethan had been working in this location, the busiest store in the district, for the past 2 days. With 13 restaurants under his company's name, he had never personally met the staff here. His usual polished suits and confident demeanor were gone, replaced by a wrinkled uniform, a fake scruffy beard, and exhaustion from working back-to-back shifts. And now, as he knelt on the cold floor, feeling the sticky soda seep into his pants, the reality hit him harder than he expected. No one cared. He pushed himself up, forcing a smile as he dumped the mess into the trash. His hands trembled slightly, not from the weight of the tray, but from frustration. "Hey, Eli," Rick finally spoke, glancing at him. "You're slowing down the line. Move faster or you won't last long here." No encouragement, no offer to help, just a warning. Ethan swallowed his irritation and got back to work. The next few hours were brutal. Orders piled up. Customers grew impatient, and every mistake he made was met with eye rolls and sighs. At one point, he struggled to refill the soda machine, the heavy syrup box slipping from his grasp. He barely caught it before it hit the floor. Still, no one stepped in. "Come on, man," a coworker muttered. "Figure it out." By the time his shift ended, his back ached, his feet throbbed, and his faith in his leadership was shaken. He collapsed onto a bench in the break room, rubbing his temples. Across from him, a young woman named Sarah sat quietly, stirring a cup of instant noodles. She was the only one who had been remotely kind to him. "Tough shift?" she asked, offering a small smile. "You could say that," Ethan muttered. She nodded knowingly. "It's always like this. No one helps, you either sink or swim." He frowned. "That's normal here." Sarah sighed, picking at her noodles. "Yeah, Rick doesn't care. He just wants numbers, and if you struggle, you're just dead weight." Ethan leaned forward. "Why do you stay?" A shadow crossed her face. "I need the money. My dad's sick. The pay's not great, but it's something." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had built this company to create opportunities, not to break people down. Before he could say more, Rick walked in. "Eli, you're on morning shift tomorrow. Don't be late." Ethan forced a nod. "Got it." As Rick left, Sarah glanced at him. "You should quit before he makes your life worse." Ethan met her gaze. Maybe it's time someone made his life worse instead. Tomorrow, things were going to change. Ethan barely slept that night. His body ached from the relentless shift, but his mind wouldn't rest. Every moment replayed in his head the indifference, the exhaustion in Sarah's voice, the way Rick dismissed him like he was nothing. This wasn't just one bad manager. This was a culture problem, one that had festered under his watch. By the time his alarm blared at 5 a.m., he was already wide awake. He arrived at the restaurant before dawn, slipping into the back entrance just as the first morning shift employees shuffled in. The air was thick with the scent of stale grease and burnt coffee. Rick was already there, barking orders while leaning against the counter, barely lifting a finger to help. "Eli, you're on prep," he snapped, not even looking up. Ethan nodded and got to work. The morning rush hit fast. Orders poured in, and the kitchen turned into chaos. Ethan struggled to keep up, juggling orders while dodging the sharp glares of his coworkers. It wasn't just the workload. It was the way people worked alone, disconnected, like gears in a machine grinding against each other. No teamwork, no support. And then the breaking point came. A new hire, a kid no older than 19, was manning the grill. His hands shook as he flipped the patties, sweat dripping down his temple. Rick was watching. "Faster, Jason," he barked. "We don't have all day." Jason fumbled. A burger slipped from the spatula, hitting the floor. His face paled. Rick sighed dramatically. "Jesus, are you dumb? Do you know how much product you're wasting?" Ethan froze. Jason bent down, hurriedly trying to clean up the mess. "Hey," Rick snapped. "You're slowing down the line. If you can't keep up, I'll find someone who can." Jason nodded quickly, his hands shaking even worse. Ethan clenched his fists, his stomach twisted. This was his company. His name was on that logo hanging outside. And this was what it had become. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay in character. He had to see how far this went. Minutes later, a customer at the front counter raised his voice. "Hey, I've been waiting forever. Where's my food?" The cashier, a girl barely out of high school, panicked. I'm sorry, sir, we're just..." Rick stormed up. "Give him something free," he hissed under his breath. "Just shut him up." Ethan stiffened. So that was how Rick handled complaints. Not by fixing the problem, not by improving service, just throwing out free food to make people stop talking. It was lazy, it was reckless, and it was bleeding the company dry. By noon, Ethan had seen enough. Rick's leadership was a disaster. Employees were miserable. Customers were frustrated, and the store was barely holding together under the weight of it all. He couldn't stay silent any longer. The lunch rush slowed, and Ethan wiped sweat from his brow. His voice was calm but firm when he spoke. "Rick." Rick didn't even look up. "What?" Ethan pulled off his cap. Took a step forward. And then, in a voice that left no room for argument, "My name isn't Eli." Rick frowned, finally looking up. "What are you?" "I'm Ethan Carter." Silence. The entire kitchen froze. Employees stopped mid-task. The cashier at the front turned pale. Even Jason, still shaking, looked like he might collapse. Rick blinked, laughed almost nervously. "What kind of joke?" "It's not a joke," Ethan interrupted. His voice was steel. "I own this company." Rick's face drained of color. Ethan let the silence hang for a moment, let the weight of what was happening sink in. Then slowly, he stepped forward. "I built this restaurant from nothing," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And I just spent 2 days working under you." Rick swallowed. "Listen, I saw everything," Ethan cut him off. "The way you treat employees, the way you ignore problems, the way you throw out free food instead of actually fixing what's broken." Rick opened his mouth, closed it. Ethan turned to the staff. "I saw you," he said, locking eyes with Sarah, with Jason, with the exhausted cashier at the front. "I saw how hard you work, how much you take on, how little support you get." Sarah looked away, biting her lip. Jason just stared, wide-eyed. Ethan turned back to Rick. "You failed them," he said simply. Rick's face twisted. "Look, you're done." The words were final. Rick stiffened. "You can't just..." "I can," Ethan interrupted, "and I will." He turned to the employees. "This isn't how we run things," he said. "Not anymore." A long silence stretched through the restaurant. Then quietly, Jason exhaled. Sarah straightened her shoulders. The cashier wiped her eyes. And Rick. Rick just stood there, mouth opening and closing before finally, bitterly, throwing down his apron. "Fine," he spat. "Good luck running this place without me." Ethan didn't even watch him leave. His focus was on the people who mattered. The people who had been holding this place together despite everything. He took a deep breath. And then, things are about to change. The silence stretched. No one moved, no one spoke. Rick was gone. The weight of his toxic leadership had been lifted, but the air was still heavy. Employees exchanged uneasy glances, as if waiting for the next blow to fall. Ethan took a slow breath. He had been in boardrooms, on investor calls, in high-stakes negotiations worth millions. But standing here, in this grease-stained kitchen, surrounded by exhausted employees staring at him with wary, uncertain eyes, this was different. This mattered. He turned to Sarah first. She had been the only one to show even a sliver of kindness to him as Eli. Now, she stood with her arms wrapped around herself, like she wasn't sure if she should feel relieved or afraid. "You okay?" Ethan asked. She hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Yeah, just processing." He nodded back, he understood. Then, his eyes found Jason. The kid looked like he hadn't taken a full breath since the reveal. His hands were still trembling slightly at his sides, his apron stained with grease from the burgers he'd been struggling to flip. Ethan glanced at the others, the cashier wiping her hands on her pants, the cook by the fryers shifting awkwardly, the prep worker frozen mid-task. They were all waiting for him to leave. Like every other corporate suit before him. Like every other person who had promised change and then disappeared, leaving them to deal with the fallout. Not this time. Ethan took a step forward, rolling up his sleeves. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "Let's talk." A few people exchanged glances. No one spoke. Ethan didn't mind. He was used to breaking the silence. "I came here because something wasn't adding up." His gaze swept across them, making sure they saw him, really saw him. "I heard complaints, I saw the numbers, but nothing prepared me for what I actually walked into." A bitter chuckle came from Sarah. She shook her head, stirring the remains of her cold coffee. "Yeah, welcome to the real world." Ethan didn't miss the edge in her voice. He turned to Jason. "How long have you been working here?" Jason swallowed hard. 3 weeks. "And in those 3 weeks, has anyone trained you?" Jason hesitated. "Rick kinda showed me the grill, but mostly I just had to figure it out." Ethan clenched his jaw, his stomach twisted. This kid had been thrown into the deep end with no support, no guidance, and then berated for struggling. "How many of you got proper training?" Ethan asked, looking at the others. No one raised their hand. His chest tightened. He exhaled slowly. "That changes today." The cashier, her name tag read Lena, crossed her arms. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" The skepticism in her voice wasn't unearned. Ethan met her gaze. "By starting over." Lena raised a brow. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Ethan said, "we're shutting down for the rest of the day." A ripple of shock. Sarah's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" "We're closing," Ethan repeated. His voice was calm but firm. "We're going to reset, fix what's broken. And when we reopen tomorrow, this place will run the way it should." Lena let out a sharp laugh. "You're just gonna snap your fingers and fix everything." "No," Ethan said. "I'm going to listen." Silence. Then, seriously, Jason's voice was barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded. Jason blinked. No one's ever done that before. Ethan's chest ached. Well, he said softly, it's time someone did. An hour later, the restaurant doors were locked. For the first time in years, the kitchen wasn't filled with the sound of orders being shouted, timers beeping, or the sizzle of meat on the grill. Instead, employees sat in a circle, some on overturned buckets, some on benches, some leaning against the counters. And Ethan sat with them. No suit, no boardroom distance. Just him in the same worn-out uniform, sleeves rolled up, listening. Really listening. Sarah was the first to speak. Rick wasn't the only problem, she said. Yeah, he was awful, but everything in this store is a mess. We're constantly short-staffed. We run out of supplies all the time. The schedule is impossible. Some of us work back-to-back shifts with no breaks. Lena nodded. And the pay, it's barely enough to survive. Jason shifted uncomfortably. I was scared to ask for help. I thought if I messed up too much, I'd get fired. Ethan's fists clenched. He listened to every word, took in every detail. And with each story, each frustration, each exhausted sigh, it became painfully clear. This wasn't just one failing restaurant. This was a systemic problem. His company had grown too fast. He trusted the wrong people to manage it, and in doing so, he had let places like this fall apart. He had let people like Sarah, Jason, and Lena suffer under leadership that didn't care. That was on him. And he was going to fix it. By the time the sun set, the team had built a plan together. Training programs, real ones, not just figure it out as you go. New scheduling policies, ensuring no one was overworked or forced into double shifts without consent. A direct employee feedback system, one that would bypass middle management and go straight to corporate. And most importantly, raises. Ethan had already made the call. Wages would increase across every restaurant, starting now. When he announced it, Jason's eyes welled with tears. Lena whispered, "No way." Sarah just looked at him, studying him. "You mean it?" Ethan met her gaze, every word. She exhaled, then finally, she smiled. For the first time since he walked into this restaurant, Ethan felt like he could breathe. Tomorrow, the doors would reopen. Tomorrow, this store would run differently. Tomorrow, his company would be one step closer to what it was always meant to be. Not just a business, but a place where people mattered. The next morning, the doors of the restaurant opened again. But everything felt different. Ethan stood behind the counter, arms crossed, watching as the first wave of customers walked in. The usual tension that had hung over the place like a storm cloud was gone. Employees moved with purpose. There was no frantic scrambling, no muttered curses under their breath, no exhausted sighs. For the first time in a long time, the restaurant felt alive. Sarah was at the front counter, taking orders with a confidence that hadn't been there before. Lena moved through the kitchen, actually smiling as she worked the fryer. And Jason stood at the grill, flipping burgers with steady hands. No shaking, no fear, just focus. Ethan exhaled slowly. It was working. He had spent the night making calls to upper management, to supply chain teams, to corporate. The changes they had agreed upon yesterday weren't just talk. New training programs were already being rolled out. Schedules were being restructured. And by next week, every employee in this store and every store in the company would see the pay raise reflected in their checks. This wasn't a band-aid fix. This was a reset. The line of customers grew, but service moved smoothly. Orders were taken, food was prepped, and trays were handed out, all without the usual chaos. Then, it happened. A man at the counter, arms crossed, scowled at Sarah. "I asked for no pickles," he snapped, shaking his tray. "This has pickles." Ethan tensed. Sarah, however, didn't flinch. She smiled calm, professional. "I'm so sorry about that," she said smoothly. "Let me fix it right away." She turned, spoke to Lena, and within seconds, a fresh burger without pickles was handed over. The man blinked, hesitated, then, with a begrudging nod, took his tray and walked away. No yelling, no escalation, just efficiency. Ethan felt a slow smile pull at his lips. Rick would have thrown free food at the guy and told Sarah to just deal with it. But now, the employees had the tools and the confidence to handle situations the right way. He stepped aside as Jason moved past him, grabbing a fresh batch of buns. The kid looked up, met Ethan's gaze, and grinned, not nervously, not hesitantly, just purely. Like for the first time, he actually enjoyed being here. Ethan clapped him on the shoulder. "Looking good back there." Jason flushed, still getting the hang of it, but, yeah, feels different today. Ethan nodded. That's the point. A few hours passed, and the lunch rush hit. Normally, that would mean disaster. Orders would pile up, mistakes would happen, tempers would flare. But not today. Today, there was rhythm. Sarah called out orders with clarity. Lena and the kitchen staff moved with precision. Jason kept the grill running without a single burned patty. Ethan helped where he could, refilling drinks, wiping down trays, jumping in when they needed an extra set of hands. And as he worked, something incredible happened. Laughter. Not forced, not sarcastic, but real, genuine laughter. Sarah cracked a joke about Lena's speed at the fryer. Jason nearly dropped a bun and laughed at himself before catching it last second. Even customers seemed more relaxed, picking up on the shift in energy. It wasn't just a better workplace. It was a better experience for everyone. Then, just before the rush died down, a woman walked in. Older, tired eyes, holding a small bag in her hands. She hesitated before stepping up to the counter. Sarah greeted her with a smile. "Welcome in, what can I get for you?" The woman bit her lip. I don't want to cause trouble, but I came in last night and my order was wrong. I didn't realize until I got home, and I..." Before she could finish, Ethan stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said gently, "thank you for coming back. We'll make it right." The woman blinked. "Oh, I wasn't trying to get free food, I just..." Ethan shook his head. "It's not about that, it's about making sure you leave happy." Sarah nodded. "We'll remake your order fresh, no charge." The woman's eyes softened. "That's really kind of you." Lena was already on it, putting the order together with care. When she handed the bag over, the woman took it slowly, as if she still couldn't believe it. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan smiled. "Thank you for giving us another chance." She walked out with her head held high. And Ethan. He turned back to his team. His team. Not just employees, not just names on a schedule. People who wanted to do good work, to be treated well, to be part of something they could be proud of. And for the first time in too long, they finally could. The day wound down, the dinner rush came and went. The restaurant stayed steady, the staff stayed strong. And when the last customer walked out the door, Ethan let out a slow breath. He turned to the team, who were gathering near the break room, exhaustion clear on their faces, but not the same exhaustion from before. This was different. This was the exhaustion that came from a job well done. They looked at him, waiting. Ethan cleared his throat. "That," he said, "was the best service I've seen in the store since I started this company." A few surprised glances. Sarah raised a brow, arms crossed. Seriously. Ethan nodded, seriously. Jason grinned, it did feel kinda good today. Lena smirked, kinda. Jason laughed, okay fine, it felt great. Ethan looked at all of them. This is how it should be, every day. Sarah exhaled, running a hand through her hair. Yeah, it should. And it will be, Ethan promised, because I'm not walking away from this. Lena tilted her head. What does that mean? Ethan smiled. It means I'll be back, regularly, not undercover. I think my disguise days are over. A few chuckles. But I'll be here, checking in, making sure that what we started today keeps going. A silence. Then slowly. Sarah nodded. Elena grinned. Jason straightened his shoulders. And for the first time, the weight of the past, the frustration, the exhaustion, the hopelessness was gone. Ethan looked around at them, at the restaurant, at everything they had built together in just 2 days. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning.